like I was totally raised in St Kilda. I mean, St Kilda is the most vivid place in my memory. My parents met ice skating at St Moritz Ice Skating Rink, which is right on the esplanade of St Kilda across from Luna Park, where they'd go after ice skating. And they'd grown up in St Kilda. A lot of the beautiful old buildings were being ripped down. I know that my mum was very upset about this, and they joined an organisation called FAG, which was the Flat Action Group. Anyway, she got onto the council, she got elected. Any education, but she had the sort of chutzpah and the skill set.
Elaine came onto the council after me, and the next one was Mary Lou Jalbert, and we all shared sort of social values. When I got onto council, they were just bewildered. They were all men. You could certainly say they were all men. Boys' club sounds benign.
There was a lot of abuse thrown around that council chamber. I mean, I think her and the other women were called witches on their broomsticks that should just disappear, and no one wants them, and there was a lot of verbal abuse. And the three of them really banded together. There was just this great kind of camaraderie amongst them, and they really changed the face of St Kilda.
So what was the area of law that you were interested in and that you
I was always
into?
interested in human rights, always. I did gender in the law, I did Aboriginal studies in the law. I also did all the other subjects that you have to do. And I worked at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre for a long time. I worked at the Aboriginal Legal Service. I worked at Freehills, which is a big law firm, for my first year out. And I remember, I think, and I apologise if anyone who is at Herbert Smith Freehills in the audience, but after 2 years there I was absolutely done. I'd paid off some of my debts because I'd spent a year in London after law school. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore, and so I decided to resign and go to the Aboriginal Legal Service. And I do remember at the time that the managing partner walked into my office, closed the door and took the phone off the hook, and I thought he was, because I'd been calling my mum obsessively, and I just hate it here, I just want to go. And I thought, oh no, he's going to give me my phone bill. But in fact what he said was, no one in the history of Freehill, Hollingdale and Page has left us for the Aboriginal Legal Service. And I was thinking, and he said, have your parents spoken to you about how you're committing career suicide? And I just thought, oh my God, they're not going to let me go. I'm never going to get out. And I went, I've already said yes to the other job. My parents are very happy about me going. Ironically, they weren't, because I think they thought that a job like that, you were never going to get paid. I think they thought it was a volunteer position. Yeah. And Mum said, but how are you going to pay your rent? I went, well, I get paid. I just don't get paid as much. Anyway, so that was, so then I was out the door, and I've never felt so free, and I started doing all court work every day, and that was a very full-on, eye-opening job, the Aboriginal Legal Service. It was baptism by fire, I have to say. And it was in the Paul Coe days, so it was always in the news, there was always something happening, but we had the real cutting-edge cases about race discrimination and also the stolen generation. That was the first time people started to realise that they could try and find their mob and their history. And so it was a really incredibly lucky time to be there, as in, how lucky was I that I had access to these people's lives and stories. And, there were some really funny moments. I mean, you'd literally be on the phone to another solicitor on the other side of the matter, and there'd be someone singing to me, someone who'd come in off the street having a song, and I'd be trying to be really professional going, can you just keep it down while I'm on the phone? But, and there was, I think the guy that had worked in the position before me, he was an older guy, he was married, and he'd had so many affairs that when I pulled open the bottom drawer, there were a whole bunch of shirts with an iron mark all the way through them. And I thought, oh, wow. And he didn't have one single one of the 300 cases in the diary. So I never knew when anything was in court. I'd find out because I'd get a call the next day saying, you're listed for, the court in Parramatta. I wouldn't even know what the matter was. Sometimes I'd go to court literally with a manila folder with nothing in it because I had no idea what was going on. And I'd get there and I'd find, and I just didn't want to look like I had no file. I'd have to stand up and argue. But, in those days, I mean, women weren't allowed to wear pants to court. And so what would happen is if you didn't wear, if you wore pants to work, and because it was a non-court day, what would happen is suddenly you'd be doing a bail application and someone would have to swap your pants and skirt so that you could go to court. So you'd be going, has anyone got a skirt on today because I have to go to court, like without realising I was going. Or you'd have one, tucked away somewhere and then...
So you had to be fairly flexible and
very
able to
flexible,
interpret the situation every day.
Yeah. And then I went off to the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, which did test case litigation. That was really interesting. And then I became a young person's lawyer, 25 and under, and criminal, human rights, immigration, civil matters, discrimination, everything. And that was my last period of being a lawyer before I left the law.
So, what was the trigger for that?
Well, it was an interesting trigger, I'd written my first play, which had gone on at the Opera House in Sydney, and it had done very well, but it was 24 hours in King's Cross, which is where I was working. I was working with homeless young people and young gay and lesbian, under 25-year-old kids who are working either in the sex industry or, having a really tricky life, actually. A lot of drugs, a lot of mental health stuff, and we would take the cases because actually it was paid for by a conglomeration of very big firms, particularly Freehills. Ironically, I did a full circle. And they paid us very well and they put a lot of money aside for us to get psych reports and to deal with the most complex matters. So the ones that, if they went to legal aid, would find that it was just too complex and no one would have the time to spend getting all different reports coordinated, meant that you could... We could spend that money and find those reports and get psychological evaluations and get sort of dual diagnosis, like where they would have drug and alcohol issues and mental health issues. And we could dig further into what some of the issues were. Like sometimes it was someone that had been kicked out of home because they were gay, they were living on the streets, they had a drug problem and they had to work what's called the Wall in Sydney, which is, a sex street where people would just curbside come along. And so interesting that my mum was in St Kilda and here I am in King's Cross, the old Paul Kelly song.
I just got, I was to say, it is, because that was one of the things that, of course,
absolutely.
Helen and your mum were pushing for at that time, was legalisation.
And they did do that.
Prostitution, I'm told I'm supposed to use the word sex worker, not prostitution, but back in those days, that was the word we used.
I remember that was a really big deal when that happened. It was huge. And I remember at the time I was at Windsor at the Catholic school and I remember a nun taking me aside and being concerned that my mother was pro-legalising what was called prostitution at the time, so that people actually had working conditions that could be, investigated and interrogated. And the irony is I always remember this one case I did when I was working in King's Cross, and it was a young woman who was a sex worker who worked at a brothel, and the police had picked her up with an enormous amount of money on her. And the amount of money that it was, I think it was like $6,000, but for her it was enormous. And so it was deemed to be the proceeds of crime or stolen. And so she was arrested. And the only way that you can actually argue in court that she hadn't stolen it was to say how she'd gotten it. And she said to me, I got it because I did a whole lot of off-book acts within the brothel that I got paid cash for on the side. Okay. But, and so I thought, let's defend it. You shouldn't have to, be arrested for, we'll plead not guilty and go in. And so I called an expert sex worker as an expert witness to say, what sort of things you do on the side and how much you get paid. And she walked in bare feet and went up there and she told the judge all the things you can do and that a young woman as attractive as my client would certainly easily get that much in a night. And the judge was so old, and he was just looking at her like, oh my God. And I remember all the police were there, and they all came in because they thought it was such a funny case. They all lined up like they're in the gallery everywhere. And eventually I had to cross-examine the policeman who'd actually arrested her, who said, I know all about those brothels because, I've been there millions of times. So I said, so how do you know how much someone gets paid off book? And he was like, I've been there a few times. I said, how many times have you been there as a client? He's like, I haven't been there as a client. And he said, but I go there, I said, in your uniform to actually investigate people. So basically, and also he just looked, and then he said, well, I haven't been there yet. But it was quite funny to cross-examine someone who absolutely lost his nerve on the stand in front of all the guys. And at the end, I remember this young woman and the expert sex worker who stayed around for afterwards. And I remember the two things that happened. One is both of them recognised someone in court that was a client. And the young woman said, let's all do a huge high five because the girls won. And so, it was just one of those little things that you remember because she walked out going, yeah, I beat the system. I actually was right and I didn't have to fold. So it was kind of a nice case to run, really.
So that first play that you wrote was about all of these experiences?
Yeah, it was.
Had you been kind of shuffling these stories in the back of your mind, going, one day I'll do something?
You don't realise. I guess I would go to dinner parties and actually people would say, oh, what did you do? We were all young lawyers and most of them were doing intellectual property or my husband was a barrister or something. And I would just talk about a case that would be pretty, I had very full-on cases. They were extreme. And so I would sort of debrief at the table and then everyone would go quiet. And my husband would go, you can't keep doing that at dinner parties. People just don't know what to say. To me it was just what I was talking about at work. Mm-hmm. So it occurred to me that, these stories are obviously having a massive impact on me, and particularly because here I was working in King's Cross and 10 minutes away is where all my friends lived having dinner parties, and they didn't know any of this, what was happening. But I also saw this really, really special community of all these young people who were having really hard times, and not just the young people, but older people there as well. Just the homeless community of King's Cross, how they had each other's back. And I thought, no one talks about their community. So it was 24 hours about what happens to them and how they look after each other as best they can in the scenarios that were happening. And there's deaths and drug overdoses and women having a terrible time. But it's how they come to each other's aid to the extent that they could. And it had a really big impact, that play. And I think that was when I thought, wow, I go to court every day and tell one story. Like my mum, my mum and Helen and Mary Lou would tell their story, and and the judge would listen, and I would be very, very passionate about my client's story, and a narrative would come about their life that most lawyers probably wouldn't tell. But I'd say my client, when they were 2, were dragged into a parked car. And where was the state then? He was just delivered home without any interrogation of what happened. And then he was delivered home to parents who were both using drugs, and the state didn't intervene on any level. So where was the state as his child grew up and had all these traumatic, responses? And at school, no one really interrogated it or looked after him. And now he's come before the courts in the criminal justice system because for the first time the state has actually intervened, and you're going to put him in prison. He absolutely deserves to be put into kind of a system where he can actually have some help. And so giving a judge a choice of that or that, but actually setting up the process of help, like the social work, I can take him right now into a care system with detox, drug rehabilitation and psychological support. I can do that today. I've got the Rolls Royce of systems set up, but if you say no, that all disappears. And so often, so you realise the power of story, and the power of story to me was one-on-one with a judge about a client each time. But then I realised when I did that particular case, that particular story in King's Cross, is that 500 to 600 people a night saw it, and they all wrote in, or the papers talked about it, and they said, gee, we all live 10 minutes away from this and we didn't know this is the world of King's Cross. We go there for parties, we point out prostitutes on the street, we point out, what we're seeing, but none of us recognise that these kids are, our kids' friends, our cousins' children, or whatever. And I felt like it humanised, and I realised that empathy is everything in storytelling. If you can create empathy in someone that didn't previously see the story.
But the actual craft of writing for theatre is, you've got to compact all of that into...
Yeah, totally. It's very hard. You've got to take a lot out.
So how did you tackle that?
Well, I went to NIDA, so I learned how to do it. Yeah.
Right.
So I did learn how to playwright. But when you say take stuff out, the first version of each one of my plays is a 3-hour version, and then you just chip away at it.
Your babies, as they call it. Yeah.
And I have a lovely director who I've worked with who actually lives in St Kilda, and we're both from Victoria. And he lives here now. In fact, I was working with him on the weekend on a film. But he used to say to me, let's just put it in the garage and we'll come back and get it later. And somehow I go, okay, as long as we're not cutting it. And of course those garages exist all over my laptop. I go, the garage, and I even call it the garage for whatever subject, so I know where all those great scenes that I loved have gone.
Yeah. So this brings us, of course, to the, Prime Facie.
Yeah.
So what was the impetus for that? Was it something that had been sort of burbling away in the back of your head for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I was at law school, and because I was a criminal lawyer, it was almost like I wasn't allowed to say that some parts of criminal justice weren't working properly, because as a defence lawyer, defence are a different breed to other lawyers, I have to say, and they very much have a kind of philosophy that unless, you have to believe the system works in a way. And if someone doesn't get convicted, then the prosecutor hasn't done their job well enough if they're guilty. But if they're otherwise, people should be assumed to be not guilty. I totally believe that, by the way, that not guilty until proven guilty. Having said that, when it came to sexual assault, I was watching these young people whose statements I would take. So I would take about 6 statements a week from young women who'd been sexually assaulted and raped, like some of them horrendous. I mean, all of them horrendous, but some of them by multiple perpetrators. And then I would take the statement down for the sheer purpose of being able to apply so they could get money for sexual assault counselling. So, there's no reason for them to lie to me, because all they're going to get out of it is sexual assault counselling. I mean, if you haven't been sexually assaulted, why would you want it, really? I would take their statements, apply, get them money for sexual assault and say, here's your statement. It's a really, cohesive statement. You can take that to the police, get them to read it, and then you can give your statement again if you want to take criminal action. Most of them didn't, because that's just how it works. The ones that did, that went to court, they never got a conviction. Not a single one of them. And so I thought, this can't be right. Like, this can't actually be. I mean, this is my own, over 6 years, little kind of own study. But I thought there's something really radically wrong. But I did also think that before I started doing these statements, that when I was at law school, I thought there's something about sexual assault that people don't see the double negative of it. So basically you have to prove, the prosecution has to prove, not only was the act done, but that the man didn't know there was no consent. And so the only way so they don't have to give evidence. It's like they cross-examine the prosecution witness, which is the woman, to say, well, clearly, your evidence is not enough to say they didn't know that you weren't consenting. And it just felt like, as a defence lawyer, it's the easiest thing in the world to win. No defence lawyer wants to think they're winning because all the odds are stacked for them. I didn't do sexual assault cases. But my friends that did would often say, oh, I won, and they'd go, of course, like how could you lose a sexual defence case? So I guess that was stewing away for years and years, and whenever I tried to have a conversation with all those gangs of people who were defence lawyers, they'd go, oh my God, you sound like a prosecutor. And I went, when it comes to sexual assault, I think I'm more of a prosecutor than I am a defence lawyer, because I think the odds are so highly stacked up against it. But I also thought I wanted to believe the system worked so that I could be in it and push right to the edge of what my arguments were. And I guess I started to think maybe it doesn't. And then I started to see the paradigm within which I was operating, which we all know is a patriarchal kind of paradigm. But then I started to see how really all of these laws were decided by generations and generations of very wealthy white men. And it wasn't just women, there were a whole lot of things that I started to think, I don't think we can call this an objective system. I mean, I was a science student before that, remember, so I had real issues with it. And then I just, I'd always thought that and argued that, but then I decided I needed to write a play to show that. And I guess also to explain to people why defence is important, what defence lawyers think. That innocence until proven guilty is the bedrock of a civilised society. However, you also have to take gender and race and see how it's affecting the decision makers and how they're actually interpreting laws and creating laws to suit the dominant paradigm.
And of course in Tessa's case it's a very kind of that fine line of consent, like she'd already had consensual sex with him and in a compromised situation, but the actual interpretation of consent.
Well, I think that what I realised after the play, and I've got another play that's actually being announced tomorrow in London, that's the next conversation, is that the law is only a reflection of community values as dictated by a certain part of the community. But in any event, it lags behind a bit. Nevertheless, it's very much a reflection of community values. So it's not enough just to interrogate the law, we need to interrogate the community and how we're raising boys and girls, and how we're actually having this conversation about accessing other people's bodies and what consent means. I mean, I had a really remarkable experience when the play first went on in Sydney, and my mum had just died. So it was like I'd come from her funeral to the opening night. So this was the preview before that. And I remember watching the preview, and there were a group of boys there that were the 14-year-old, a whole drama class was there. And they were very engaged, aside from crinkling their chip packets the whole way through, which drove me nuts. But anyway, I am the writer. I was like, no. But afterwards, they stayed around with their drama teacher. It was a boys' school. And they all queued up to get, the actor to sign their scripts, and they were so excited. That's the best theatre I've ever seen. That was amazing. And then one of them, in all his absolute innocence and enthusiasm for the play, said, "I didn't even know that was rape." And the drama teacher looked at me, and I think in that moment I thought, it's much bigger than the legal system. It's actually about how we talk about these things.
Yeah.
And so, so it's now become, now I show the film. Oh gosh, I didn't know it was up there. I show the film of the play, and then I do a whole speech about the law to judges all over the world. Like I did it to all the judges in Victoria. I had a great night the other night in Sydney, where they had a big national judges conference with the judges of Australia, and I was the after dinner talk, and basically I stood up there and said, "Here's 3 things you can do right now, judges. You can all go back to your office and have a no rape myth court, and then you can also do this, and you can also..." They're all sitting there like, "Oh, whoa." But I thought I've never had such a captive audience of judges, and also I'm never appearing before them again, so it doesn't matter. But yeah.
So how was it for you that, I know it was first put on in Sydney, but having the big sort of the London production with Jodie Comer, and for a writer to see your words come alive?
I've written 40 plays, but having said that, coming alive, it's always exciting. But Jodie really, I think when it went on at the West End, before the opening night, a little secret that the dress rehearsal, she forgot a whole lot of lines and sort of stood there a bit scared. Yes. And I thought, this is going to be a disaster.
Well, a lot of lines to learn.
I know, but there was a point where we all thought, uh-oh, we're in trouble, because she's not trained. So, actors who are trained are taught to have consistency all the way through. That must have scared her so much, because she went home and she never dropped a word ever again for the whole run, for 6 months, on the West End, for all the time on Broadway, nothing. But I do remember going to the opening night thinking, because a producer had said to me, "Oh, you're brave, going straight to the West End, not trying it out at a smaller theatre first." And then it occurred to me, oh my God, I'm an idiot. This could be a disaster. If I don't do well with this, my career's over. I'm never going to actually go to the West End again. And so that was kind of a shock. But thank goodness it did so well. And it did very, very well.
Can we briefly talk about RBG and how that came about?
Well, I was always obsessed with Ruth Bader Ginsburg when I was at law school as a woman judge who was a social justice warrior who seemed to always be 10 steps ahead of everybody else. And I felt like her dissents were kind of leaving this trail of how you could actually legislate for things about equality and kind of light years beyond anybody else. And I felt that because she hadn't resigned when everyone thought that she should, and I understood her reasons for not resigning based on separation of powers and not being told what to do by Congress, but also a whole lot of other things. She saw Hillary coming up, so there's a slight vanity of thinking, I'll be on the court, Hillary will be the president, I'll be able to write these dissents, she'll be able to enact them straight away. And I guess it was the culmination of a life's work, really. And so I just wanted to explore that and actually, I guess give her back her kind of dignity and the reason she did things. And I still think, maybe I'm being completely, I've just been talking to all the people in New York about this. If they have an election in America where actually Kamala maybe gets in, then we might see a different response, because a whole lot of her dissent judgments will actually be these letters that she wrote to the future. So you might see why it's great she didn't resign, because that last 10 years of her, those last years she wrote the best dissent she could ever read. I've read everything she's ever written, so I'm a sort of walking encyclopedia on her.
Yeah, but those dissensions can make a hell of a lot of difference to...
But, just having a female hero like that had grown up in the sort of 30s or something, and, well, I don't know when she grew up, but whatever just as in her whole kind of... She really knew a lot about race, she knew a lot about gender, she thought about things really deeply, and she was a bit stuck in her time.
Having been a journalist and a court reporter, I've always thought that courts are theatre in themselves. Yeah, and I love that bit at the beginning of it when she talks about shuffling her papers so they'll think she's dumb. I mean, that must have been fun for you to play around with all of that stuff.
It was. It really was. I mean, I think... there was a few times where you realised the witness was arrogant enough to think being cross-examined by a woman was going to be a breeze. So you let them relax into it a bit and then you absolutely destroy them. So, I mean, it's a real sport, cross-examination in a way. And sometimes it can be too much of a sport and we've got to be careful that, you know, like you do it for the reasons that you're supposed to do it. But I think I wanted to show the arrogance of a young defence lawyer to start with, and then show that she believes in the system and she plays in the system. I mean, what was really interesting to me is I'm now very close to a whole lot of judges at the Old Bailey because they've actually changed the law in the UK based on the play. In fact, I got a phone call, I think, on the second day of after the opening from a... Oh, thank you. On the second day, I think at about 9 a.m, I got a phone call, and having had the opening night and the reviews and it went so well, I was finally relaxing into a sleep-in because actually no longer being a lawyer but being a theatre person, of course we're up all night and we sleep in the morning, but I answered my phone because I didn't recognise the number, and it was like a judge from the Old Bailey saying, oh, you don't know me, but I've got your number from one of the barristers, I'm Justice such and such from the Old Bailey. And I braced myself because I thought, oh my God, they're going to complain about something I've done in the court, in the play. I saw your play last night and I've been up all night thinking about it. And I thought, I am in really big trouble. I went completely cold. I said, yes, Judge. Yes, Judge. And she said, and I'm actually the judge that writes the directions to the jury, like for all of the matters. And she said, and I actually stayed up all night and I've rewritten the direction to the jury on rape. And I've used words from the play, and I just wanted to get your permission to use them. Like,
amazing,
yes.
Amazing.
But, you know, I put down the phone, and, you know, thank you. It's not me, it's who saw the play. It just goes to show if you tell a story and it gets under someone's skin, it might be the one person that can make that change. And it was really interesting to me. And I think that, you know, then, you know, ages later, I met a whole bunch of judges in Liverpool when I was there for a book launch that I was doing. And I was there because the character's from Liverpool, and Jodie read the book for the UK version. And her dad took me on a pub crawl while I was there. But there were two men in the audience that I could tell were judges. I think because I'm married to one, I could pick them a mile away. And afterwards they came up and said, oh, we'd just like to say that we have to read your direction to the jury every day. And I went and they said, and we love it. We call it the Prime Facie direction. Or the Jodie Comer direction. And I thought, oh, that's very funny. So, you know, you just realise, but, you know, lots of little things like that, you just think, isn't it interesting that you could, like a piece of art can affect a change that you never foresee would be possible. And all the judges now have to watch the NT live version of the play before they're allowed to sit on rape cases.
Oh, wow.
Which is phenomenal to me.
That's amazing.
I mean, that's the UK. Yeah. I'm much more popular in the UK.
Yeah. but
still
the play
here, slowly but surely.
The play has been performed around the world.
Around the world, yeah. It's been in about 100 countries now, which is...
So you've got 100 Tessas.
Yeah, I do. And, you know, all different races and religions and backgrounds. I mean, it's been in Turkey and Iceland and Scandinavia and China and... it's been everywhere, all up and down Latin America, and so yeah, it's kind of very, but it's not mine anymore. It's a story I put out there that other people have taken and run with and interpreted, and I feel that I guess if you can show something that you can see and you can show it in a way that people can see it and hear it. I don't know, it can start a conversation in the right time, in the right place, and I think that just happened to hit that zeitgeist.
And of course, not everybody goes to the theatre, but more people read books, and you've now got the book version.
Yeah.
How difficult was that, or what was the process?
It was actually it was a really lovely process. It wasn't hard at all. I mean,
but you've got to, when it's coming through one person in a one-hander, it must be very different to have other characters.
I mean, I'm actually quite verbose, so the fact that I could write the story, I thought all that stuff came out of the garage. I put it back in. I was like, oh, now I can actually say exactly what the chairs look like. Yeah. And so, you know, like I could resurrect all those scenes that I thought were really important that I'd had to take out of the play because you can only ask Jodie to learn so many lines. So, and that play was 4,000 words longer than RBG. So, you know, because it goes at speed.
Yes.
So, and you know, you think, I mean, RBG started off the same amount of words, but then when I realised that when she becomes 80, she spoke so much more slowly. And so Heather was interpreting her as speaking much more precisely. And so I thought, wow, this is going to go for 4 hours if we're not careful. So I had to cut a lot out of that as well.
And another, Jail Baby.
Oh, Jail Baby,
Tell me about that.
So that hasn't been on in Melbourne yet or overseas, but it's about to go on overseas, I think. It is it's about jail reform, really. And I guess because I worked with young people who were always being imprisoned, it started to occur to me that they were often being imprisoned mostly for property offences. And then I looked into it, and of course, we really have a strong thing about property offences because we really value our smart TVs, maybe more than we recognise what's going to happen when the police come and actually arrest someone for, breaking in and trying to steal it. Obviously it's there's got to be some kind of like cachet around what you do, but it just seemed to me that it was all these young boys that came from a real underclass that were actually involved in groups of people that would do property theft. And so it's just about a young boy who is in a local soccer team, has got a really tricky family background, has to get $500 to go on a soccer tournament thing that he really wants to go on, hangs out with these guys, steals a smart TV, and he's the one that takes the whole fall. But what happens to him in prison, which was what happened to so many of my young male clients, is they get raped and really destroyed in prison. They come out absolutely so homophobic that they're violent. And I think you don't realise what you're doing when you put someone into prison. And when you actually put a young boy into prison for a property offence, it just feels like absolutely counterproductive to any sort of social good or any sort of, there's no rehabilitation or anything like that. And what happens to some of those young boys that they don't tell people because they're so ashamed and so embarrassed. And I had one young boy who had been raped in prison, and when he came out, he was on parole. He was in there for a property offence, like for stealing or something. And when he came out, he had a girlfriend, and she wanted to go to some countryside thing, and they went to Surfers Paradise or something. And because he went out of the state, he didn't realise he was breaching his parole, and then he got put back inside. But when I went to appear before him for court, I said, let me tell the judge what happened while you're inside. We might be able to find a way to keep you out. He said, no, because my girlfriend will be with me, and if she hears, I'll just never be able to face her again. So he'd rather go back inside and risk it happening again than actually have a public acknowledgement of what happened. And, even the place that I worked at, they tell me every day they have exactly those stories, like young men coming out saying, this is what happened to me in prison. And I don't think people know that. And I think that, we all sort of live our relatively middle-class lives with our items that we care about. And, if something gets stolen and you report it to the police, you don't realise what all those steps are that go. And before you know it, someone's in prison. And if they were a middle-class kid, they'd have a lawyer, they probably wouldn't go to prison. Or they'd have a barrister or whatever. And it just felt to me that we're prepared to throw away young people's lives for a property offence, and they become property that's bought and sold in prison. And I think that the play takes you on a journey where you actually decide at certain points, well, yeah, of course he should be arrested. Look what he's done. And yeah, sure, he should have to pay a price. But how much of a price are we prepared to make people pay for our smart TVs? I guess is the question. But it's come back for a couple of seasons in Sydney, and there's a lot of jail reform that's happening around it as well. So I guess I'm really big on the idea of words having an impact and stories having a reason to exist, even if it's just a different conversation around the dinner table.
So if you felt like using writing and theatre that you're able to achieve, like not more, but in a different way than when you were actually working within the legal system yourself? I
think more, and I think what happened was I got offered a position in the judiciary in New South Wales as the same time as I got offered as a residency at the National Theatre. So I really reached a T intersection in my career, and I went, what am I going to do? And of course, one of them paid really well, and the other one paid really badly. And one of them meant I had to go to London, and my whole family had to move to London. And but I just knew exactly what it was I wanted to do. And I thought, because I did enjoy being a lawyer, I thought, I'm probably going to really regret this one day. I'm really going to miss it, and I haven't missed it at all, because I'm so involved with lawyers anyway. But having said that, it was the right decision for me, and it feels still very much the case. So,
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
When my mum became the Mayor of St Kilda, she's the first ever female Mayor of St Kilda. Not a day goes by where I don't think I'd love to tell her something, or I laugh about something that I just miss her terribly.